Evan, Niecy, and Richard. So it's great to be here today. It's interesting about today because we really didn't talk about the show at all until it was released. So it's been very fun and thrilling to be talking about our work after a period of making it and releasing it. The great thing about this cast today is I've worked with these three incredibly iconic actors in different parts of my career. So when I think I said earlier, I was sort of working on this for 10 years, and when it finally came time to make the show, these were my first choices. And I called them all up, and I'll start with Niecy. I've worked with Niecy since Popular in 1998. She did me a solid. She played a talking lobster on that show. And I think through the years, we've seen Niecy, who we all knew was a comedic genius, become this incredible dramatic actress that I always knew was there. And I think people have recognized that for a while. So when we were writing the role of Glinda Cleveland, I called up Niecy and I said, I want you to do this. And she said, okay. And Niecy, let's talk about one of the most moving moments that I've had since the release of the show was when I called you up that first week and I told you how well the show was doing. And you got very emotional talking about Glinda. Can you talk about that moment?
First of all, hello, everyone. Second of all, I love that you protected me and said I got emotional. The truth is I cried like a baby. And I cried like a baby because I said to Ryan, it is my prayer that wherever Glinda Cleveland's soul is resting, that she finally feels heard. She finally knows that her story has gone all around the world. That was important to me. And it was interesting because we started talking earlier, Richard and I, and he said, well, when did it dawn on you that the weight of what you were doing really was for more than even this one character? It is every woman, it is every person who has never been heard. And I said it didn't really happen in my mind until after we started the filming process. I thought it was only one voice. And then I realized, oh, I know a lot of Glinda Clevelands. I even been a Glinda Cleveland before in my life. So,
which is someone who is not believed, someone who is not considered. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love when you say that we've all been Glinda Cleveland. If we haven't, we will be. I think that's very, very true.
Yeah.
And then we get to Mr. Evan Peters, who I've known since he was a teenager. I cast him in the first season of American Horror Story. To be honest, I cast him, I was joking about this, but I cast him because he looked like Jessica Lange. He played Jessica Lange's son. And on the first day of Evan's shooting, we were like, holy shit, this kid can act. So to go for me from that moment with Evan to this moment in time where he's being compared to and seen and talked about in the same breath as Robert De Niro and Marlon Brando and Leonardo DiCaprio, I could not be more proud of you and thankful that you're in my life. This was a show that was really daunting and difficult. The subject matter was incredibly difficult. And to be honest, we were casting the show for 6 months and we saw a lot of people. And there was just something missing. And so I remember saying to my casting director, I'm going to call Evan. And I did. And Evan was very quiet. And I said, just read them. So Evan, when you read those first couple scripts, can you talk about what went through your head and how you considered taking this part? And then how did you prepare for the role of Jeffrey Dahmer?
Well, thanks for saying all that, first of all. You sent it to me, and I read it, and first of all, the writing was brilliant, and I was terrified. I really went back and forth on whether I should do it or not. I knew it was going to be incredibly dark, an incredible challenge. But you recommended that I watch the Dateline Stone Phillips interview. And in that, you really see how he speaks about what he did. And I was fascinated by that, and I wanted to dive into the psychology of that extreme side of human behavior. So I read as many books as I could, psychology reports, confessions, timelines, all in an attempt to try to understand why he did what he did. And then, of course, there was the physical stuff.
Yeah, talk about the physicality, because at one point you wore lead weights around your arms and you wore lifts in your shoes and you practiced that walk, and you basically stayed in this character, as difficult as it was, for months.
Yeah, I mean, we did 4 months of prep, 6 months of shooting, and he's a very straight back. He doesn't move his arms when he walks, so I put weights on my arms to see what that felt like. I wore the character's shoes with lifts in it, his jeans, his glasses. I had a cigarette in my hand at all times. I wanted all this stuff, these external things, to be second nature when we were shooting. So I watched a lot of footage, and I also worked with a dialect coach to get down his voice, the way that he spoke. It was very distinct, and he had a dialect. So I also went off and created this 45-minute audio composite, which was very helpful, and I listened to that every day in hopes of learning his speech patterns, but really an attempt to try to get into his mindset and understand that each day that we were shooting. So it was an exhaustive search, trying to find private moments, things where he didn't seem self-conscious, so you could get a glimpse into how he behaved prior to these interviews and being in prison.
Right. And one of the things I remember when we finished it, you called me up and you said, well, I gave it my all. I gave it 120%, which I'm here to say you did. Interestingly enough, this is one of the first times we've all gotten together, and the other night, Niecy went up to Evan and said, Evan Peters, nice to meet you, even though they had worked together for months, because Niecy, you can talk about that. Like, it was, Evan was so deep in character.
So deep in character. People will say, what is Evan like? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know the man. Because in his process, I respected his need to keep the distance and the tension so that it played out on screen, as opposed, because I'm coming in initially like, hey, how you doing? Good morning, and he was like, oh, no, ma'am, and so I was like, oh, and then I realized, I said, oh, he's in his process, and I want to respect that, and I want to, keep him there, and, and I prayed for you a lot. No, for real. No, because this is weighty. And when you stay in it and you're tethered to the material, like bone to marrow, your soul is troubled at some point. You know what I mean? And I could see him getting tired. And I just said, well, I'm just going to make sure I keep him in my prayers, because this is a lot and he wants to do it justice. So, yeah.
I really appreciate that, and I loved working with you. You were still very warm, and I keep saying, but your grandmother has this amazing saying that really stuck with me, because I was trying to push myself to my limits, but also respect them.
And I told Evan, I said, well, he was leaning one day, and I said, well, my grandmama always said, hang tough till you get enough. And when you get enough, still hang tough. And he said, well, all right. And I would just say, you okay? And send him on his way. But yeah.
Yeah, along those lines, like everybody, I think, is very interested in how Evan did it, but also in staying in it. But Evan, just briefly before we move on, can you talk about how you got out of it? Because you said that you had watched Step Brothers recently, and everybody always thinks of Evan as dark and brooding, and I'm like, absolutely not. Evan is hilarious. He's spent Thanksgivings at my house. My children have sat on his knee. He's such a lovely guy. But can you talk about it? Was a big responsibility, but coming out of it, what did you do?
Yeah, it was doing the role. I wanted to give it 120% the whole way through, so I brought in a lot of darkness and negativity, and so really it was just having that end goal in sight, knowing when we were going to wrap, and finally being able to breathe and let it go and say, okay, now it's time to bring in the joy and the lightness and watch comedies and romances and go back to St. Louis and see my family and friends and watch Step Brothers,
Evan Peters, me and you in a rom-com right after this.
Let's go. I'm down.
So Richard Jenkins is one of my all-time favorites. I think everybody in the world loves Richard Jenkins. And I had the honor of working with him with Julia Roberts, and we shot all of our stuff in India in a movie called Eat, Pray, Love that happened long ago. I had wanted to work with Richard since directing him in 120-degree weather. And we wrote, Ian and I, this role for Richard, and I sent it to him, and it was really, really a difficult part. All these parts were hard. And I sent it to him with no expectation, thinking that he would carefully consider it, and I was very thrilled and shocked a couple days later when he called me and said, you know what, I'm going to do it. And Richard, can you talk about that moment from the call to saying yes?
Yeah, you called me and I said, well, what's it about? He said, Jeffrey Dahmer. He said, read it. So I think you sent me 3 episodes.
Yes, 3.
The first 3 is all they had written. And it interested me because as a father, first of all, it is an incredibly complex human that they've written, this guy. I mean, it's the humanity is just, it's one of the most complete people I've ever played. It's just really amazing. And but I kept thinking to myself, if Jeffrey Dahmer is your son, do you stop loving him? And you don't. How do you deal with the fact that Jeffrey Dahmer is your child? Is it your fault? Did you not see something? And he wrote a book. Lionel Dahmer wrote a book called A Father Story that's absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's a beautifully written book. And it's a cautionary tale to say, I miss this stuff. But if you have kids, don't let this stuff go by. Listen to your children when they're trying to tell you something. And, I just thought it was the last thing I thought about a Jeffrey Dahmer movie, that it would be so human. And that's what you wrote. It was beautiful.
Yeah, the thing that I haven't really talked about it, but the thing that I'm talking about now is like, we weren't really interested in Jeffrey Dahmer, the monster. We were interested in like, okay, well, what made the monster? Who was complicit in the making of the monster? There were many, many different things involved in that. And it was always going to be a very complicated human story. But one of the things that we always we tried in the making of it was we tackled, systemic racism. We tackled homophobia. We were always thinking of the victims. And I wonder if Niecy could talk a little bit about that, because, you certainly had many a dark, difficult day on set, because you were sort of, in our show, the representative of the community who were not heard and not listened to. What has been your reaction to, people talking about the show, and when you were making it, how did you feel about centering the victims in the storytelling? And Glenda Cleveland was, of course, a victim.
I felt responsible to get it right. I felt that for me, you kind of got to experience this movie through this woman's eyes, because she laid eyes on it all. She was the town crier, she was the, and I'm pulling these air quotes from heaven when I say nosy neighbor. But so she was the one, that portal to say, are y'all seeing what I'm saying? And nobody is going to do the thing. My hardest day really, I feel like, was probably when the police came and walked the baby back into the apartment. Because I just kept saying, this really happened. You saw this child. But because of a black woman doing the complaining, which is the racism of it all, because there was a homosexual relationship, which is the homophobia of it all, this baby was walked back into this house and met his demise, and it didn't have to. And so there were many days I left set with tears in my eyes, because the weight of all of these things happening and knowing that all of it didn't have to.
Right. One of the things I love about the show is there's 2 episodes in particular where we center Richard's character and we center Niecy's character. There's one of my favorite scenes in there, and I'll talk about both. 3 scenes I want to talk about is there's an episode after Jeffrey Dahmer is convicted. You know, we really do in the show try and point fingers at a lot of people who are to blame for this continuing. But I love the scene, Richard, and we talked about this earlier, but I love what you said, where your character goes to your son and says, I'm responsible and I take responsibility. Can you talk about the filming of that day? Because that is a scene that a lot of people talk about.
Well, that terrified me that day. It's not, I mean, it didn't terrify me, but it terrified me. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know. I mean, it's really kind of where this character was led to this spot. And we got there, and I looked in my son's eyes, and I told him. But you know, Evan is brilliant in this. I mean, he's brilliant. And I work with a lot of actors. This kid is really great, as is Ms. Nash. I mean, there's some brilliant performances in this. And I think the reason that it's so, one of the reasons it's so popular is that actors were not just given their space. Actors were expected to find the lives of these people. And nothing was hurried. Nothing was, you know, if you weren't ready, you had the time to get ready, and it was an extraordinary experience. But that moment was, I have no idea what I was going to say. I mean, I knew I was going to say it, I just don't know how I was going to say it. But which is, I mean, that happens most of the time, if you want to know the truth. But it was an extraordinary day for me. Yeah.
And Niecy in her Cassandra episode 7, the very last scene of that, the last shot of that episode was you in the hotel room, which really happened with Glinda and Jesse Jackson, where he said, let it out. And I've never asked you this question, but we used your first take in that scene. And I don't think you had a lot. I don't think you needed a lot. Obviously, you had it from the moment. What were you feeling when, after 7 episodes and months of this material, somebody said, express yourself, and you did? Do you remember that day?
I say it a lot in my marriage, but in that moment, in my instrument, I felt fully seen. I felt like Glinda was fully seen in that moment. Somebody heard her. He said, I'll listen. I'll be the one. And it had not happened up until that point. You know, ma'am, you're abusing 911. Stop calling here. You know, the police walking the baby back in. All of these things happen. And then when somebody finally says, I'm listening, a person of note, a person who didn't have to spend the time, you know, could have been off doing any other thing, but to say, I'll hear you. It was just like the weight of the world coming off your shoulders in that moment. And finding finally a soft place to land.
One of my favorite scenes in the show is the sandwich scene, which is between Niecy and Evan. And it was very, very difficult to film, but it also, I let other people sort of, I didn't direct any of these episodes. I was obviously interpreting and working with people that I loved, but I came for the beginning of the show. I was there all the time, but I was definitely there for that scene, and I remember thinking, like, I can't wait until these actors do this scene. And I thought it just had such incredible power, and I loved that you two people that I loved got to do this work in that moment. And Evan, can you talk about that day? But do you remember much about that day?
Not really, no.
No.
But I do remember you were amazing in that scene, and it was it was hard to figure out what my character was doing there. You know, why was he doing this? And he wanted you to take back the complaint, but at the same time was going to try to punish you for that, but also knowing that you had all of the power. And it was really amazing to see your character stand up to Jeffrey Dahmer and put him in his place, and he really had no choice but to walk out. So it was beautiful to shoot.
Niecy, what did you think about that day?
I was looking forward to it as an actor because there was so much unknown. I did not know how you were going to play it, you know, which ultimately informs how I play it, because it's a dance. It's, you know, there's reciprocity in that part of the process. So it was just the kind of thing where that was the one scene where we do have the confrontation or the face-to-face that I was looking forward to the most, but also kind of scared about the most, because you know that it is definitely going to put a stamp on what we were doing. And I just tried to steel myself and say, well, let me see what he does. And it's a dance. Let's go. You know, and when I was able to take that breath, when he finally walked out that door, she tried to put her big girl pants on. But I said, Lord have mercy. I felt like Glenda's knees was shaking and everything, but she was trying to act like she wasn't scared. He hit that door and she ran over there and locked her and said, woo! My shoulders went down. I said, you know what I mean? Because I was sharing that space with Glenda, but I said, listen, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
One of the things, interestingly enough, about the show was, you know, we spent a lot of time making it, researching it. Everybody, you can tell, who made the show, I think, went into it with utmost care and thought. And sometime in the next, I think, week, our show will have been viewed by 1 billion hours streamed, which sort of makes it one of the biggest hit of my career, in the 25th year of my career. And something that none of us understood or saw coming. Does anybody have any understanding, maybe there's no understanding, but any idea of why has the show touched such a nerve in the world? What is it? Anybody have any ideas? Look at us shaking our heads like we don't know. I have two theories. I feel like the world is such a dark place and people are looking to somewhere to put their anxiety, you know, and that's one thing. The other thing is, I think since COVID, people have been really interested in the idea of mental health. And the show, every character has a moment talking about that. And I think people are very interested in that idea. But any other theories, any other ideas? What have you thought about it at all, Richard, anything?
I think they watch because of me. Isn't it?
I think that's fair. That's true.
No, that is not why they watch. Because if that had been true, my other stuff would have been. As I said to you earlier, Ryan, I don't think I have no idea. It's just, and I think that's what's kind of wonderful about it, is because it's so surprising, and you just kind of take it and you embrace it, and then you let it go and you move on to the next thing, because it's never happened to me before in anything I've ever been in, and I think that's. You know, if anybody knew why it happened, it would be happening all the time, and it just isn't. So, but it was, it's a beautiful surprise. It was.
Well, I know one thing I will say about it is that the industry was kind, but I was definitely told you have a lane, and it's comedy. You know what I mean? Stay over there because that's what you know how to do, and to be. To be in this project and to act alongside the likes of these beautiful, beautiful actors and hold my own in this space.
Hold your own.
I just felt like I proved to the industry that I'm not just a one-trick pony. You know, I always knew it, but Thank you. I feel finally like people see me like I see myself. So thank you.
Well, that's cool.
Thank you.
That's cool.
I think Danielle and Emily, we have some questions.
Yes.
Here.
Our first one is from Denton Davidson from Gold Derby. When you're working on something like Dahmer, this is for Ryan, which is based on a true story, how do you manage staying true to the story and expanding where you need to effectively convey the message of the series?
Well, we had, I think 3.5 years. I said I was working on this for 10 years. There was a lot of things that were time. I mean, I'm glad that this took as long as it did. We had 4 or 5 researchers on this at every time. We spent a lot of time researching it. Some characters are condensed, things were moved around. But for the most part, we got the benefit, I think, of just time and research. I've said it publicly before, but we really did our due diligence. We reached out to 20 friends and family of the victims. We didn't hear back. We were desperate to sort of get other inputs. And so we just really heavily relied on several sources and several magazine articles, books, etc. We just tried to be as true as we could, and we tried to interpret the story. But also going into that, we definitely had something to say. I mean, I had something as an artist. I felt this was the biggest thing that I had ever worked on that sort of explored the idea of white privilege. I mean, this guy was basically busted 10 times and got away. And I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to tell a story about homophobia. I wanted to tell a story about policing. I wanted to tell a story about racism, systemic racism. And so we were just very conscious of talking about all of those things over and over and over in the writer's room and with the actors as well. We had many conversations. Evan will tell you, I think from day one, we had a conversation about this is what the piece is about. This is why we're telling this story. We, again, aren't telling the story of a monster, but how the monster was made. That was always the DNA of the project.
This question is from Lynn Marie from Your Web for Niecy. I read you filmed Dahmer and Reno 911 at the same time. How did you come out of the deep emotions that were caused by filming Dahmer to be present and funny for Reno 911?
That's a great question. I was born funny. That's that's an innate thing. You can't go to a class where they teach that. You know what I mean? So finding the joy in pain has been a trick I've been using a long time. You know what I mean? I come from a very trauma-filled youth. And in that trauma, I always knew I could make people laugh, and I always knew I was funny, but I used it as a coping mechanism in my pain. I would laugh literally to keep from crying. So I knew that standing in that space of the pain of the Glenda Clevelands of the world, that I needed an outlet. I needed a way to lighten my experience. And it just was a happy coincidence that Reno 911 was like, we filming at the same time. I'm like, well, let me put on my baby hair and my big booty and come on and see what's going on. So I felt like, wow, this is the perfect gift. I get to come over here and I get to lay heavy into the thing that they said I couldn't do, and then go over here and take it off and play with my friends and do the thing I know I was also born to do. So it served me in the moment because some of the days were very, very heavy. And so I'm grateful that, unlike Evan, who had to keep it on the entire time, I could take it off and put it back on.
This one is from Destiny Jackson at Deadline for Evan. Having taken such dark, meaty roles, I'm wondering, what are some of your safeguards or things you do to keep yourself afloat?
That's a good question. I think I think having the end goal in sight, knowing that the project is going to be finished, pacing it out, I think was helpful. I have all sorts of different things that I do in my everyday life to keep me happy, functioning, a normal person. It's at the end of the day, it is a job, and you sort of have to compartmentalize. And so I think, when I go home, sometimes it's or rather after the shoot, it was comedies and lighthearted things, songs, music, making music. So all those things really help to keep me afloat.
This is from Lily for Richard. You did such a superb job at playing Lionel Dahmer. It's such a complex character to play. What was the most difficult scene to shoot?
It's interesting, but I don't know. I think maybe the scene that Ryan brought up earlier, after he's convicted, and I tell him that was my fault, and it was interesting because here I only have 30 seconds, a minute maybe, to tell him the most important thing I've ever told him in my life, because they're going to take him away and put him behind bars. So that's a brilliant way to put you in that situation, to tell your son the most important thing you ever told him, that you don't have any time. So after it was over, I was thankful that that's where I got a chance to do it, as opposed to some place where I had all the time in the world. But, it's one of those things where they were all hard, but fun hard. There's sometimes there's a joy to pain, the other way around, that when you're there, you feel a joy that you could get there, and that maybe this was connecting. That's because that's what we do. I mean, that's the way we paint. I can't sing, I can't dance, can't paint. This is what I do, and hopefully an audience sees it, understands it, and can say, I've been there too myself. So this for me was, I know it sounds weird, but it was a joy to do.
This question is for everyone. In which way can this story be a cautionary tale for today when it comes to systemic injustice?
Well, I think that the obvious answer to that, I would point to episode 2, in the show, every episode actually, because we made sure those moments were in there. But when someone says, please believe me, do, I think that this show, in every episode, it had a moment where there was a Glinda Cleveland saying, something is wrong, or this doesn't feel right. And so often being dismissed by the patriarchy of the time, 1991, 1992, I still feel like that happens. I think that we're just much more aware of that now in society, and don't take the easy answer. But for me, that's what it's about. It's believing people who feel like they've been wronged or are saying, I need help. And every character has that, even Dahmer, there are moments where he reached out and said, something's wrong. His father, Lionel, refused to have a difficult conversation with him. I think that theme of advocacy is written throughout the entire series. That's one of the things I'm the most proud of it for. I mean, Niecy, you and I spoke about that a lot, and specifically about, we hope that people watch this show and learn something about policing, even family dynamics. I think that's mental health. I said that earlier, but I think that's baked into the cake of this show.
That's it. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. It's fun to be in a room.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.